Good morning or good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. My name is Anushka Perim, and I'm from Forest Peoples Program, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes to allow any stragglers to join, and then we will get started. Okay, I think we'll get started to make sure we have plenty of time left at the end for questions. So before I get started on the main point, just a couple of housekeeping points. First, a reminder that this webinar will be in both Spanish and English, so please choose a language channel if you don't speak both languages. There are instructions in the chat for how to access this if you're not sure. Este seminario web estará en inglés y español. Haga clic en el icono del globo terráqueo y seleccione el idioma. Second, this is the first webinar we've done on this topic, and we'd love your feedback at the end on what you thought and how it could be better. We'll share a link to a very, very small survey at the end, but in case you need to drop out early, we'll also share the link now. Also, there is a question and answer box available. So if you'd like to ask any questions to our panelists, feel free to add them here throughout the webinar. We've also planned some time for questions and answers at the end. And finally, if you would like to, I would encourage you to share your name and your background or organization and the country you're joining from in the chat so that we can all get to know each other a bit better over the course of this webinar. Anyway, thanks again to everybody for joining us. So let me just start with a bit of background to the webinar series. So for those of you who haven't come across us before, Forest Peoples Program, or FPP, is a human rights organisation based in the UK that works with Indigenous peoples and forest peoples in tropical forest countries to support their human rights, and in particular, their rights connected to their lands and territories. In addition to supporting communities to defend and secure their land rights, we also seek to support communities to strengthen their autonomous governance, manage their territories, and maintain and revitalise their traditions, including, of course, their traditional food systems. And many of the communities we work with are telling us that strengthening and revitalising their food systems is an increasingly important priority. While working alongside communities is at the heart of FPP's objectives, we can see that the struggles that our partners in tropical countries are facing are connected to many of the struggles we see and read about in agriculture and food systems in Europe. And we also believe that just and durable solutions need broader alliances for change. So this new webinar series, which is called Cultivating Resilience, aims to facilitate conversations between people working on the ground in Europe in agriculture and food systems and our partners in tropical forest countries who are doing the same. It's a little outside our normal way of working at FPP, but we hope it'll be a small contribution to collective efforts to make a better world. I'd like also to acknowledge the support of climate farmers and the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture, among others, for their time and guidance in supporting the preparation of this series. We hope it will be a space to explore common challenges, understand differences, see connections, and build solidarity between all those who do the fundamental work of producing our food and caring for the land where it is produced. Today's webinar is our first one, and we'll look at land concentration and corporate capture in food systems. We are starting with this topic because ultimately, the way land is owned and managed is fundamental to creating just, equitable, and sustainable food systems, and because loss of or lack of access to land is a huge and increasing problem around the world. Globally, 70% of farmland is controlled by a mere 1% of farms. On the other hand, 84% of farms and farmers out there survive with a mere 12% of the global farmland area. Plus, as we witness regularly in our work at FPP, for Indigenous peoples and forest peoples, this process of land concentration is not only an economic phenomenon of industrialization, but one that is often linked to violent eviction and destruction of biological and cultural heritage. It is clear that part of the struggle for better food systems is to ensure that land is fairly distributed and is in the hands of those who work and care for it, rather than in the hands of extractive corporate and industrial systems that extract more than the land can take, often to provide profits only for a few. So for today's topic, we have a great range and lineup of speakers joining us to discuss this topic. I'll introduce them properly as we go along, but first let me welcome and thank each of them for joining us today. Apu Efer Silvano and Apu Rolando Escobar from the Indigenous Federation FECONAU in Peru, Anne von Leeuwen, a regenerative farmer from the Netherlands, and Dr. Ward Ansil, who is the land tenure team lead at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Our first speakers today will be Apu Efer Silvano and Apu Rolando Escobar. Apu Rolando is the Vice President of FECONAU, the Indigenous Federation of Ucayali, and Apu Efer is the former leader of the Indigenous Shipibo-Cunibo community of Santa Clara de Uchuña. Santa Clara de Uchuña is an Indigenous community whose ancestral territory stretched over approximately 86,000 hectares of forest in Peru. It was officially recognized as an Indigenous community in 1975. Since then, the community repeatedly sought recognition and titling of its full ancestral territory, but only a fraction of the territory was ever titled. In 2012, the company Plantaciones de Pucallpa irregularly acquired ownership of nearly 7,000 hectares of forest within this untitled part of Santa Clara's traditional territory. Since then, forests on and around this area have disappeared, and a mega oil palm plantation has been established. The plantation is now operated by Ocho Sur, a company backed by US investors, which sells its palm oil to international markets, including in Europe. I'd like to invite Apu Efer and Apu Rolando to speak to us some more about their situation. I'll switch into Spanish for this section, so if you haven't already, please choose the English channel to continue listening in English. Apu Efer, Apu Rolando, bienvenidos y gracias por acompañarnos hoy. Apu Efer, empiezo con usted. ¿Podría contarnos un poco cómo han influido las actividades de Ocho Sur en las actividades tradicionales de su comunidad, especialmente en lo que se refiere a la producción de alimentos?
Hola, buenos días a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Efer Silvano Soria, de la comunidad Santa Clara de Uchuña, ¿no? Gracias por esta oportunidad para poder un poco describir la historia de la comunidad y a conversar. Entonces, yo como Efer Silvano, eh, desde antes que ingrese la empresa Ocho Sur o Plantaciones Pucallpa, aquellos años, nosotros como comunidad vivíamos tranquilo, eh, con nuestras costumbres ancestrales, prácticas de medicinas, agricultura. y recogíamos nuestros medicinas, ¿no? A tradicional y pescábamos también en las quebradas, alcochas, nos alimentamos de los animales como venado, majás, no algo natural, ¿no? Antes que llegaría la empresa Plantaciones Pucallpa, y ahora que es empresa Ocho Sur. Cuando ingresé a la empresa, todo eso ha terminado, que en nuestro territorio ancestral se ha deforestado casi 7.500 hectáreas, donde que nosotros buscamos nuestros alimentos y era nuestra farmacia, ¿no? Y totalmente todo eso se destruyó y ya no se puede recuperar. Y en eso estamos, ¿no? Y bueno, compartir mi historia. Era muy difícil de afrontar esta empresa porque era un poder económico, tiene un poder político, ¿no? Entonces yo, aquello tiempo, yo era jefe de la comunidad, casi el 2022, donde que yo no, cuando yo no hice caso su trabajo en la empresa, querer trabajar con la comunidad, después de desbocar los 6.000 hectáreas, me llamaron para trabajar con ellos, yo nunca acepté eso, trabajar con ellos. Y luego, después de 6 meses, la empresa ingresó a la comunidad, me sacaron como APU de la comunidad, como jefe, y ya hicieron una estrategia para que me saquen, ¿no? Y para que ingrese otra persona que puede trabajar con ellos. Y entonces desde ahí empezó el problema grande, donde que yo denunciaba y el jefe, entrante de todo mandaba archivar a favor de la empresa. Y la comunidad también se prestó por cambio de dádivas. eh, entonces ya la empresa tenía a su gente dentro del territorio, dentro de la comunidad, ¿no? Y eso es su estrategia de la empresa. Siempre, como somos unas personas humildes, de falta de estudios, y por eso nos agarran por ahí. Quizás también por falta de nuestro presencia de nuestro Estado peruano, ¿no? Y cambió mucho nuestra vida, ¿no? Desde entonces empezó las denuncias contra la comunidad, contra mi persona, contra nuestra federación que es FECONAU, las prensas a favor de la empresa, eh, amenazas, y cambió totalmente la vida de la comunidad. Dejó de tener la autonomía de la comunidad. La empresa tomaba decisiones desde la ciudad de Pucallpa, se iba a la comunidad con las actas ya hecho de acuerdo, hacer firmar a las comunidades, hermano. Entonces, de ese momento, eh, la comunidad de Uchuña perdió la autonomía. También ha perdido las costumbres, donde que nosotros trabajamos conjuntos, como acá lo decimos en Minga. Ahora ya no se ve ese trabajo, ¿no? La gente ya tiene otra mentalidad, otro pensamiento, este, ah, occidental. Y entonces ya nosotros cambiamos ya un poco de ideas, ¿no? Mis familiares, ya no tenemos la misma unión como antes, ¿no? Y lastimosamente eso ha pasado dentro de mi comunidad y sigo en la lucha. Y hasta ahora estoy amenazado desde el año 2022 que ingresé como jefe de la comunidad. Desde entonces yo sigo luchando por mi comunidad, gracias a FECONAU, nuestro federación que tiene 40 años de lucha, y gracias a ellos estoy acá explicándoles lo que ha pasado dentro de la comunidad. Si tuvieran algunas preguntas, lo puedo responder.
Muchísimas gracias, pues, Efer. Sí, me parece muy grave las consecuencias sociales y ambientales también para su comunidad, los efectos también sobre el sistema alimentario en su comunidad. Pero si paso a Pu Rolando, am, este caso no es aislado en Ucayali, ¿cierto? Desde su perspectiva, ¿cómo está afectando la apropiación de tierras por parte de las empresas a los pueblos indígenas, incluidos sus sistemas alimentarios, su nutrición y salud, su bienestar en Ucayali en general?
Eh, Muchas gracias. Bueno, aunque ya me presentaron, mi nombre es Rolando Escobar Chávez, del pueblo indígena Shipibo-Conibo, actualmente vicepresidente de FECONAU y al mismo tiempo defensor ambiental indígena de la Amazonía peruana. Hoy no solo estoy para compartir una experiencia, sino que también estoy para visibilizar una situación que vulnera derechos humanos, destruye bosques y amenaza sistemas alimentarios indígenas. En ese marco, desde mi punto de vista, la apropiación de grandes extensiones de tierras por parte de empresas en Ucayali tiene muy profundos impactos. Y un caso claro es que ya justamente mencionó mi colega Efer, que viene ocurriendo la expansión de monocultivo, en este caso la palma aceitera, impulsado por esta empresa depredador que es Ochosur. En este contexto, pues, la deforestación asociada al monocultivo es uno de los principales problemas. Grandes áreas de bosques amazónicos han sido transformadas en plantaciones, eh, como es el palma aceitera, lo que implica la pérdida directa de nuestra biodiversidad y de las fuentes tradicionales de alimentación de las comunidades indígenas. Porque sin el bosque, sin la biodiversidad, eh, nuestra forma de convivencia, nuestra alimentación es distorsionada. Eh, ya no tenemos dónde cazar animales, ya no tenemos dónde extraer plantas medicinales, no tenemos dónde pescar. Entonces, eh, esta, este cambio de de la biodiversidad, pues implica mucho, ¿no? Y afecta mucho a la población indígena. Repito, como el bosque es nuestro mercado natural. Entonces, además, esta deforestación está afectando seriamente los recursos, el recurso agua. En este caso, pues, los cuerpos de agua están cada vez más reducidos, están reduciéndose están desapareciendo de los cuerpos de agua como es las quebradas, las cochas, el río, entre otros, ¿no? Ahí ven la imagen cómo, aparte de lo que la, la empresa palmicultor viene depredando, también hay depredación por parte de los taladores ilegales. La imagen muestra pues cómo los taladores ingresan a nuestro territorio a talar maderas valiosas, lo que nosotros venimos cuidando. Sin embargo, otros aprovechan. Bueno, en términos de salud, También hay impactos importantes. La contaminación del agua y del suelo pues generan enfermedades, mientras que la pérdida del bosque limita el acceso de la medicina tradicional. Eh, otro aspecto muy crítico, otro aspecto muy crítico también es la división social que mi colega Efer acaba de mencionar, ¿no? Dentro de las comunidades, pues, viene ocurriendo eso. La presencia de esta empresa, bueno, ya no quiero mencionar, pero sí, lamentablemente tengo que seguir mencionando porque es caso muy, muy particular en esta región, que es Ocho Sur, pues, que viene generando tensiones internas dentro de la comunidad. No solamente Santa Clara y Uchuña, sino también otras comunidades también que vienen siendo afectados por esta empresa, generando divisionismo. Mientras algunos comuneros pueden ver oportunidades, ¿no? de trabajo, económica, pero hay otros comuneros que sí defienden realmente su territorio y los bosques. Esto pues debilita la cohesión social en las estructuras organizativas de la gobernanza indígena, ¿no? De gobernanza comunal. Eh, Es por ello, es fundamental visibilizar, aunque ya el mundo conoce esta situación. Sin embargo, repetimos en este webinar, es importante y fundamental visibilizar estos impactos, fortalecer la defensa territorial y promover alternativas sostenibles, ¿no? Que respeten los derechos colectivos y la relación de los indígenas con su territorio. Eso es desde el punto de vista de nuestra organización y que es lamentable mencionar, eh, bueno, eh, eso es lo que ocurre en nuestros territorios indígenas, que en la región Ucayali, en el territorio peruano. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Abu Rolando. No sé si nos puede comentar un poco qué estrategias han estado utilizando las comunidades y las federaciones indígenas para resistir la apropiación de tierras por parte de las empresas y además qué ayuda necesitan para este desafío.
Eh, sí, gracias por pasar las fotos y eso es una muestra clara, ¿no? Que acaba de pasar las imágenes, cómo la empresa Palmicultor viene depredando el bosque, extensiones de territorios indígenas han sido deforestados. Bien, respecto a la pregunta, en primer lugar, nosotros venimos fortaleciendo la defensa legal e incidencia internacional. Por ejemplo, han presentado denuncias y quejas ante instancias como RCPO, la comunidad, ¿no? Ante la Comisión Interamericana de Desarrollo de Derechos Humanos también se ha presentado exigiendo el respeto al territorio ancestral frente a la expansión de monocultivos, ¿no? Esto demuestra que no solo resistimos localmente, sino que también llevamos lucha en espacios nacionales e internacionales. En segundo lugar, también mencionar que estamos impulsando la seguridad jurídica del territorio a través de saneamiento físico legal. El lideramiento y la titulación es fundamental para nuestros territorios. Estas acciones, pues, son clave porque sin título o con títulos incompletos, las comunidades quedan más expuestos a invasiones y despojo de los territorios. Esta estrategia fundamental es la autoprotección territorial y la organización comunitaria. Eh, Se han creado y fortalecido guardias indígenas en nuestro territorio indígena, sobre todo la población indígena Shipibo-Conibo, ¿no? Los comités de vigilancia. Bueno, los comités de vigilancia son reconocidos por la entidad competente acá en nuestro país. Eh, Sin embargo, aún sigue siendo débil. Eh, Así estamos organizados frente a las invasiones territoriales, la tala ilegal y las actividades ilícitas. Es uno de los amenazas importantes dentro del territorio comunitario, ¿no? Entonces, estas iniciativas pues combinan conocimientos ancestrales con herramientas modernas como es el monitoreo satelital. Ahora mismo nuestra federación tiene un mini central de monitoreo satelital de la cual nos permite monitorear nuestros recursos forestales, nuestro territorio desde el gabinete. Entonces creo que es importante eh, que también nos ayuden a fortalecer por ese lado, ¿no? Asimismo, las comunidades están pues promoviendo alianzas intercomunidades con organizaciones aliadas como ONGs, cooperación internacional, instituciones públicas también, eh, lo que permite una respuesta más articulada frente a las amenazas comunes. Sin embargo, repito, eh, esto sigue siendo muy débil por la ineficacia pues del gobierno de turno, ¿no? Entonces, creo que por ahí también mencionarle que sí necesitamos el apoyo, ¿no? Eh, Quizás también destacar los espacios de formación y fortalecimiento de capacidades de nuestros jóvenes y, to, y, toda y a toda la población, ¿no? Eh, Donde capacitan en derechos indígenas, gobernanza territorial, justicia indígena y participación política. Es importante para nosotros capacitarnos en estos temas, ¿no? Finalmente, pues, mantenemos una estrategia política de fondo, la defensa de la autonomía, el autogobierno y su sistema de vida. Sin embargo, esta resistencia ocurre en un contexto muy difícil. Los líderes y defensores se amenazas, enfrentan criminalización e incluso intentos de asesinatos por su labor que viene realizando. Hecho concreto, ahora mismo nuestro amigo, mi colega Efer viene siendo amenazado y ya ha habido intentos de asesinatos. Entonces, esta labor que nosotros cumplimos no es tan fácil que digamos. Nosotros tenemos familia, así como ustedes. En ese sentido, pues, sin embargo, nosotros no nos paramos, no nos quedamos brazos cruzados, eh, no somos cobardes, seguimos luchando frente a estos atropellos que vienen siendo gente que vienen de afuera. Eh, bueno, eh, ¿qué es lo que necesitamos de, de, de nuestros aliados? Lo que necesitamos es muchos apoyos de pronto solidarios, protección efectiva para los defensores indígenas, no solo medidas en papel, sino también una protección real, seguridad a nuestro lado. Saneamiento y titulación completa de nuestros territorios, porque si nosotros no tenemos eso, vamos a seguir siendo expuestos a invasiones y despojados de nuestros territorios. Entonces, para esas acciones no contamos con recursos. Apoyo técnico y financiero, apoyo técnico y financiero para el monitoreo de nuestros territorios, la implementación de las guardias indígenas y proyectos productivos sostenibles. Muchas veces hacemos proyectos pilotos y que jamás, nunca más han sido replicados en otras comunidades. El proyecto termina y ya quedó ahí. Entonces, y otras comunidades siguen esperando que llegue ahí también el apoyo. Entonces, pienso yo que cuando formulen proyectos deben ser sostenibles, no solo pilotos, no solamente para una comunidad pequeña, un grupo de personas, ¿no? También es importante el acompañamiento legal. Nosotros no contamos recursos como para pagar abogados. Nosotros no generamos ingresos como organización indígena, es sin fines de lucro. Entonces, ahí necesitamos un apoyo de nuestros aliados. También que nos ayuden a visibilizar internacionalmente para los casos que puedan, para que no queden impunes, ¿no? Las denuncias que nosotros presentamos siempre queda impune. Entonces, creemos que con el apoyo de nuestros aliados podemos avanzar más.
Muchas
Muchas
gracias,
gracias.
Apu
Muchas gracias.
Rolando. Muchas gracias, Abu Efer, por sus intervenciones muy importantes, muy ricas. Am, Continúo en inglés ahora.
You're muted, Anushka.
Apologies, everybody. My double-clicking mouse strikes again. Um, Shifting continents now. Our next guest is Anna van Leeuwen from the Netherlands. Anna has a diverse background. She's previously worked on a museum about the relationship between humans and the rest of life at Artis Royal Zoo, and she co-founded the Embassy of the North Sea in Amsterdam. In 2019, she started Bodemzicht Farm and Foundation with her partner Ricardo Cano Mateo in Malden. In March 2024, she moved to the 45-hectare Lenterland Regenerative Community Farm Gergel in Lochem, and she's in close contact with the regenerative movement in the Netherlands, including as a founding farmer of the European Alliance for Regenerative Agriculture and as an EU Mission Soil Ambassador. Welcome, Anna, and thank you for joining us. Welcome. And could you share a little bit about your farm and how it was started and some of the challenges you've experienced in acquiring farmland for small farmers?
Yes, great to be here. First of all, I want to say I'm deeply humbled listening to Eva Silvano and Apu Rolando and the hardship they have to face, because that's certainly not comparable to my position. So I just want to start there and acknowledge that before telling and sharing my story. And I was struck by what Eva Silvano said, that it's a Western way of seeing things that causes a lot of destruction. And that's actually also what set me on my own path of starting a farm. Because when I grew up with a lot of love for life as a small child, and I also had a big love for the arts, and I wanted to combine those things as a student. And then the exam committee told me at university that that wasn't a good idea, because why would I wanted to study art courses and take on biology courses as well? Because these are two separate things, was the story that was told to me. And that really struck something in me, because I started to realize how strange it actually is that we divide the world in nature on one side and culture on the other side, and we act as these are two separate things, two separate worlds, I would almost say. That became the main focus of my own study trajectory, that relationship between these two so-called separated worlds, and led me to see that exactly this Western way of seeing things is about detaching the culture from what we call nature, and detaching ourselves and disconnecting ourselves as human beings from the rest of life. And that led me into a position in which first I didn't know what I could do, because I was also taught that I'm an individual and that the best thing that I could do was to be sustainable. And sustainability, I think it didn't start off like that, but it sort of ended now with the idea that you have the best you could aspire to is to be a less negative human being, to have a less negative impact. And that self-image, which I think is also very much connected to a certain worldview, was the only image I knew. So I was also stuck in that worldview. And I got stuck in the process because I care. I care about life. I care about seeing the amount of bird species go down in the place that I grew up in, the Boulder, and it hurts me, and I want to do something about it. And so I was in that process that I didn't know what to do. I had sort of like half a burnout, and I was looking for ways to act, but I couldn't find the ways. That was also in around the time that I found out that climate crisis, loss of life, and social inequality is interlinked and strengthens each other in a very negative way. And it was then when I saw, when I was actually at a low point personally, that two beautiful things happened to me. I met my current husband, Ricardo Cano Mateo, a Spanish biologist, by chance or by faith, I don't know. And he has a huge love for frogs, and I think I'm his second love, and I'm very happy to be in that position. And he was studying biology and thinking, how come that I learn only about frogs, but not from the frogs? Like, why am I studying dead animals in jars? And why is the future prospect that I seem to be having as a biology student to make nature reserves, to put a gate around it, and to remove the humans from it? So also that split in thinking and acting. And we met each other on that journey. And for me, that was a huge turning point when we also saw a beautiful documentary made by the Chinese-American filmmaker John D. Liu. And he had this documentary about the regeneration of the Lhasa Plateau in China, which is a huge area with a very famous before and after image, 20 years in between. But he beautifully showed that a very degraded ecosystem could be regenerated by actually engaging as human beings and ensuring that not only the butterflies and the birds and the water returns to the place, but also the social economic perspective of human beings. That was around 10 years ago, the first time for me that it clicked, that of course, social, economic and ecological impact, they go hand in hand. And that is such a worldview issue because I didn't even know in the paradigm that I grew up in that was an option, that everybody could thrive. And of course, a lot of indigenous people already know this because they live it. But also, sadly, I never came in contact with those worldviews at university, which is also very telling, I would say. So once we saw that, we were sold, and we thought the most beautiful thing we can do is to reconnect to place, to reconnect to community, and to start farming. That was a journey of visiting inspiring farms in Europe where people were regenerating ecosystems and with it a community, inclusive, human inclusive. And we visited an amazing farm in the south of Spain, La Jonquera. They were regenerating 1,100 hectares. And then again in Sweden, an inspiring project where Richard Perkins could make the numbers work on 7 hectares. So a small-scale farming. And then we were looking for access to land, which is difficult also in the European context because land is super expensive, certainly in the Netherlands. It's one of the most expensive, most speculative countries in terms of land. So the land prices are just insane. So it's 100,000 euros per hectare. And as soon as there are buildings, on the grounds, it just goes through the roof, basically. So we wanted to farm. We had 2,000 euros in the bank account and a car, Suzuki Alto, that was about to go off, and 2 laptops. So that was about it. So we needed to do something very lean. Then we started our first farm. And it was also challenging because if you don't have access to land, you don't have access to finance because nobody's going to finance a farm without land. So we had sort of a chicken and an egg situation. But we worked very hard. We worked on several routes to get access to funding. And in the end, we could start the farm because somebody did put money on the table, a loan, but it was still very, very challenging to make it financially work. But then once the farm was running, people could see, okay, it sort of works, and then the network grew, and also the options for us to get things financed grew. And after 4 years, the farm sort of grew a little bit out of control, but in a beautiful way, because it also became a foundation in which people were interacting with the land in a different way, with each other in a different way. And we were working on a regenerative culture change as much as we were farming food. And and at that moment, we had the opportunity to move to another place in Lochem in the east of the Netherlands, and where we could farm 10 times bigger. But more importantly, I think where the ownership model is different and that befitted us more. So here, now we're farming at Gagel Farm in Lochem, and we have access to 45 hectares, but the ownership in the farm model is split. So there is juridical ownership that is with a foundation. There is economic ownership that are with co-owners of our farm. And we have creative ownership, and that is for the people working here as entrepreneurs at the farm, and they run the farm as if it's their business. But the beauty of the model is that everybody, no one is the owner of the place, and everyone is the owner of the place. So by redirecting ownership, we can make this place a community farm again, and we can also ensure that for generations to come, it's going to stay a regenerative community farm, which also means that we remove the place out of the speculative markets. Because just as the previous speakers were already saying, it's the mindset that leads to cost efficient driven logics that always lead to monocultures and degradation, and that is of course the source of a lot of this destructive thinking. So I'm very grateful that I can do what I do here at the land, and it also gives me an opportunity personally to reconnect again with everything that I care about, which is also the land, the birds, the community, and to grow food, and not only food, but also try to be a flying wheel for different kind of work ethics, different kind of thinking, different kind of worldview, which hopefully will be a paradigm change, in which we get out of the extractive paradigm and move into one in which we actually facilitate life and support each other in our journey. So I'm very grateful to be among the speakers here today, and also to listen to everybody's stories.
Many thanks, Anna, for that story. That's really interesting to hear. I'm sure there are many questions coming out of these, so I'm hoping people are remembering to add them to the question and answer box. I'm going to move on, but our next speaker is not, in fact, a speaker, but a film. We wanted to include our partners from Indonesia in this seminar, but because of the time difference, we couldn't have them speaking live because it's the middle of, well, the early hours of the morning. So instead, Martha Dock, an Indigenous Dayak Bahau activist from Indonesia and the director of Perkumpulan Nurani Perempuan, or PNP, recorded this film to share in our session. Martha conducted an interview in the community of Long Isun in Kalimantan, Indonesia. The women of Long Isun have established a farming cooperative that reflects the collective nature of Dayak Bahau agricultural systems. In addition to managing individually held orchards, they maintain a shared orchard where production and benefits are distributed communally. While this space is primarily used for rice cultivation, the cooperative has also diversified into processing other products such as gula merah, palm sugar, and cacao, reinforcing both food security and collective economic resilience. However, millions of hectares of community lands and forests in Kalimantan have been destroyed for industrial activities, including for oil, coal mining, palm oil, and logging. The community lands of Long Isun itself have also been targeted for timber and palm oil. This film tells a little bit of how the community cares for and lives from their lands and how they organise to fight back against industrial exploitation on their territory. Before we start, I just want to apologise. We weren't quite able to add the Spanish subtitles in time for this webinar, but the interpreters will be able to read out, I hope, from the English subtitles. Thanks very much. And over to you, Kate.
Dia dumanji di kurim. Dia kau ngeluno na ke kau kawang kakau. Kayu hulim kita ah. Nuti hele.
Hak beh-beh lepo kuati nun lim selain kakao tek nun lim
Dia nungsat. Pisau.
terai
Terai oh.
upek kayu putek antuhu halam lumak kah atau halirin lumak?
Halirin lumak ah.
Mereka sudah tinggal di sini, masyarakat adat sudah lama tinggal di sini. Sekitar 700 tahun yang lalu sudah menetap di sini. Jadi mereka lebih tua dari negara Republik Indonesia ini. Sudah ratusan tahun dan wilayah ini merupakan wilayah nenek moyang mereka, diperuntukkan untuk mereka dan tanggung jawab mereka adalah menjaga hutan dan tanah mereka. Di sini wilayah hutan adat mereka itu 80.000 hektar lebih dan hutan itu yang saat ini diperjuangkan untuk mendapatkan hak masyarakat adat atas wilayah mereka sendiri. Nah, hingga saat ini belum ada perkembangan yang signifikan dengan pengakuan hutan adat mereka, sehingga mereka terus berjuang hingga ada pengakuan dari pemerintah agar masyarakat dapat mengolah wilayah adat mereka sendiri. Untuk saat ini mereka masih mudah mengakses hutan mereka. Tetapi ketika investor masuk, maka mereka akan dilarang. Banyak pelarangan untuk masuk hutan. Karena perusahaan atau investor merasa ini konsesi mereka. Sehingga masyarakat tidak punya hak untuk masuk ke wilayah adat masyarakat sendiri. Nah, oleh karena itu, masyarakat adat ini berjuang untuk mendapatkan wilayah adatnya. Nah, agar ada keadilan bagi mereka sehingga tidak ada orang yang datang begitu saja lalu merampas hak-hak mereka. Mereka harus minta izin dulu kepada masyarakat karena mereka yang punya wilayah, punya tanah, punya hutan di sini. Pengalaman kami bersama masyarakat Longisun di sini itu pernah terjadi kriminalisasi pada tahun 2014 ketika perusahaan masuk di wilayah adat mereka dan mereka bekerja di wilayah adat Longisun tanpa izin dengan masyarakat sebagai pemilik lahannya, masyarakat adat. Bahkan mereka memetakan tapal batas kampung itu tanpa partisipatif sehingga masyarakat ini tidak tahu kalau wilayah mereka ini sudah masuk di konsesi perusahaan, sehingga mereka meminta perusahaan untuk tidak beroperasi di wilayah adat mereka, dan yang terjadi adalah masyarakat dikriminalisasi. Harusnya ketika pemerintah memberi izin, pemerintah kan bisa saja dia memberi izin kepada siapa saja untuk berinvestasi. Tetapi wilayah yang tempat mereka berinvestasi itu kan ada manusianya di dalamnya, ada masyarakatnya di dalamnya. Tidak serta-merta diberi izin mereka langsung masuk, tidak berdialog dengan masyarakat dan mengambil sumber daya alam masyarakat begitu aja. Namun harus tetap kita perjuangkan karena ini salah satu upaya mereka untuk mempertahankan tanah mereka. Jadi begini, ketika wilayah mereka diambil alih oleh investor, mereka akan dilarang masuk hutan. Sementara sumber ekonomi mereka ini dari hutan. Nah, seperti ini. Mereka buat ladang, mereka membakar lahan. Sementara nanti dari pemerintah tidak boleh membakar lahan, tidak boleh berburu. Nah, sementara mereka penghasilan mereka itu, sumber kehidupan mereka, pasar mereka adanya di hutan. Semua ada di hutan. Seperti saat ini saya panen, ini merupakan hasil tanah mereka, hasil bumi mereka yang mereka kelola setiap tahunnya.
Kami kelompok perempuan Longisun sangat sayang dengan tanah kami, terutama alam kami. Kami tidak mau merusak tanah kami, makanya kami tidak setuju dengan mereka yang merusak hutan kami, terutama perusahaan-perusahaan yang masuk mengambil kayu dan mengambil segala hasil alam kami. Kami sangat mempertahankan tanah kami, makanya prinsip kami, inilah prinsip kami. Kami bisa melahirkan anak manusia, tetapi tidak bisa melahirkan tanah. Inilah prinsip kami perempuan Kampung Longisun.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks also to the team who put together that video. We had hoped to have a colleague from the Indonesia team here to answer any questions, but unfortunately that wasn't possible. But if you do have any questions related to the film, please do put them in the Q&A, and we can always provide answers after the event. So please go ahead with that if you'd like to. I'm going to pass over to our final speaker for today, who is Dr. Ward Ansil. Ward is a development economist and policy analyst and a senior land tenure officer and lead of the land tenure team at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. He's previously worked at the Agricultural Research Centre for International Development, CIRAD, including secondments with the International Land Coalition, as the global lead technical specialist responsible for data, research, knowledge management and learning, and at the University of Pretoria as a senior research fellow to the Postgraduate School of Agriculture and Rural Development, and as the co-director to the Centre for the Study of Governance Innovations, which he founded in 2012. So a very illustrious background. Ward, welcome and thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to just hand over to you to give us a more of a global overview of some of the issues we've been discussing today. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Anushka. I hope you can hear me. I can't turn on my camera, so it says that the host can, but that's up to you. Here we go. Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I first apologize because my speech here will be of a totally different nature, and I've been very interested and more very touched by all the stories that I've heard and that describe well the situation on the ground. It was very impressive, and it makes me all the more motivated to continue this work we are doing, but at a global level. So my talk here will be really giving you an overall global image of what all of these people speaking before me are living every day on the ground. So thank you once again for letting me participate and listen, but also not to talk. I'll share my screen, and for this you need to give me access as well to share my screen. There we go. Thank you. Here up. I hope you can see it now in not yet. Here we go, in presentation mode. So I will give you a bit of a global image of what is going on regarding land concentration, and I'll talk a bit about the status quo and some invisible, for us at least at global level. I think the presenters before showed very well that they are not as invisible than we think, but in the statistics often they are. So I'll give you a bit of an outline presentation first on the land holding distributions, go a bit into the drivers, and again putting some global figures on what we've heard here, and then finish on what I call here below the tip of the iceberg. And everything that I'll present here comes from 3 reports I've authored over the last 5-6 years. The uneven ground you might have seen on land inequality that I published with ILC. Unearthing less visible trends of land concentration that I wrote together with Mark Wegerer from the University of Pretoria. And then the status of land tenure and governance that we just published a month ago at ICART in Colombia, and then bringing all this together in this presentation. So let me start with land holding distribution, or better known as land inequality or land concentration. And this is first, data is coming from the first report, the ILC report that we published in 2021, where we simply gathered all Gini indexes. So the Gini index is an index measuring inequality on land. So the land indexes from the literature, putting this together over a long term of about 100 years. And it's a bit quick and dirty because the measurements between countries are different. Over the years were different. The data collections methods were different. So it's probably statistically not very solid, but I do think that it gives a simplistic but good image of what is ongoing. And what we see here is that land concentration has been decreasing up till about 1970s, 1980s, and then globally started increasing. And this in all regions in the world, as you can see in the second graph. Latin America is on the top there, the dark blue or black line, where land concentration actually happened more than 100 years ago, and where now it's stable, but at a very high inequality level. And for all the other regions, it is now increasing, even in Africa, which is the pink line, where we saw longer than the other regions, still decreasing and quite low land concentration. But even now, since 2005, 2010, even in Africa, land is now being concentrated and inequalities are increasing. The other lines, the North American, obviously the dark pink one, very high. Europe increasing steadily, although quite low in the beginning, now very strongly increasing. And so we can now say that in all regions in the world, land inequality and land concentration are increasing. This is the latest work coming from the latest report, where we now have not precise data, the data collected from the literature, but provided through the statistics of FAO, very precise data in more than 120 countries, and where we can now start calculating based on household ownership and corporate ownership land inequalities. And here it confirms the previous slides, but in a much granular way. So distribution of agriculture land it shows that it is very deeply unequal. When we did this exercise, we started by taking an average. And so what we did is we calculated the land holdings for the top 10 and the lowest 40%, so the top biggest and the smallest 40% of the world. And we did this per country and did an average among these countries. And there we saw that the top 10 of the largest land holdings operate on average 56% of the agricultural land. But by doing so, what does that mean? It means that countries, big countries like the United States or Canada or Argentina or Australia have the same weight as small countries like the Netherlands, Belgium or Luxembourg or Rwanda or whatever, because it's just an average of the inequality index per country. So the second exercise we did is putting this according to land mass, doing this the very same exercise according to land mass. So aggregating these indicators, not according to the averages of countries, but averages of the total land mass. And what we see there by doing that is that the top 10 largest land holdings operate and control more than 89% of all agricultural land. So inequality and concentration increases drastically. So giving the larger countries like the United States, Argentina, South Africa, Australia, which are the most concentrated countries, a big weight proportional to the landmass. So if we look only at the landmass and do this exercise on inequality on landmass, 10% largest land holdings own 89% of the agricultural land. So a huge land inequality, huge concentration globally. And what is worse, if we do this exercise and take into consideration the quality of the land, tenure systems, so private, public, and customary lands, and also landlessness, because when you take land, you actually only assess inequality among those who own the land and not among those who have lost their land in the process. So if we try to quantify also landlessness and integrate that in the calculations, these inequalities increase even more. If we only take into consideration tenure, for example, and we look at private tenure, so not customary, excluding customary and excluding public lands. Actually, in several countries in Africa, this inequality is almost 100%. So meaning that the lowest 40% own very close to 0% of the land. And these are the little circles that I emphasized here in the graph. So huge inequalities and increasing over time. Second message I wanted to give is more on the drivers, and I don't want to come back on all the drivers pushing for more inequality and concentration, but there's three that I would like like to emphasize, and these are probably the more invisible ones, and that are not only directly related to land, but more that related to the farming systems or the value chains that in which land is embedded. And the first driver, I think you've all mentioned it and all heard about it, is often called financialization and the proliferation of new actors into the land sector with new types of control. And I don't think this is new to you. What we can do now is starting to put figures on that. And here I give the example of work we did with the land matrix, which tracks all the large investors and investments into land. And what we see over the last 10, 15 years, when these large-scale land acquisitions started after the food price crisis in 2008, 2009, is that these investors have shifted drastically. Where in the beginning, when we started tracking, there was about 3 types of investors, mainly individual investors, also corporate investors, of course, and then thirdly, public investors like public sovereign funds, etc. Where now, and when we did the exercise in 2025, most of these investors are corporate and financial companies. They account now for 70% of the investments in land and of the large-scale land acquisitions. And of the 70%, about 51% are pension funds and investment funds. Very important to notice because is that 73% of these entities now operate on a shareholding basis. And this is very important, as I will show you later, because it makes it much more complicated to track. And important aspects that I want to highlight, and that came very well out of the presentations of the previous speakers, is that among these large-scale land acquisitions, and here we did a survey in Africa, about 78% of them complied with fewer than half of responsible investment principles, or the VGGT principles, the voluntary guidelines on tenure. 20% actually showed no compliance at all with international recognized principles for sustainable and inclusive investment. So the stories that we've just heard are very much reflected in these global statistics. And on the right, we show here the density of corporate investments, where that in the 2000s this was relatively low and the density very low. Now in 2023, when we did the last exercise, and you can see how dense corporate investment in the land sector has become, and totally globalized, as you can see here. And that brings me to the second point, is that this corporate concentration and the vertical integration that is applied by these companies. And I'm citing here Porter, where he says, as information, communication, and transport technology have improved and regulatory barriers to global trade and investment have diminished, new ways to organize production and distribution on a global scale are developing, including regarding lands. And that's where the practices regarding land and the integration of land in agricultural value chains has become very important. And it's all about diversifying the risks of these companies, controlling the costs, and increasing bargaining power, whether that's by controlling the volumes, promoting standardization and specification, but also across the interrelation and the integration of these value chains. And what we see is that the companies now engaging are fully integrated into huge global companies. And I'm giving here a couple of examples. One big one that goes from the farm up to the fork, full integration of the value chain, including land in the business model, is, for example, 3G. And I think none of you knows 3G, or very few have heard about 3G or JBS. BlackRock is maybe a bit more known, but these companies, although unknown, and when you go to their website, very little visible, have huge control of what is happening on land. For example, 3G owns, and I'm looking at my notes here, AB InBev, which is the #1 brewery in the world, but has acquired as well SAB Miller, the Brazilian brewery, which is the #2 in the world. In the meantime, they acquired the Restaurant Brands International company, which is the owner of Burger King, with almost 18,000 restaurants in over 100 countries. Acquired as well Tim Hortons, the Canadian coffee shop, and just now acquired Kraft Heinz company, which is one of the 10 biggest food companies in the world. And so when you see Coca-Cola, when you see Burger King, etc., you think this is a very integrated company already. Well, actually not. The mother company, the umbrella company on top of it, owns all the chains that you can think of and that you see, and that is 3G Capital. And this is integrated in a full value chain, which also includes land in there. And then thirdly, what is important to mention, and I think many of the presentations showed that, is the political and policy influence. First of all, large scale is an easy policy choice for governments, politically attractive, very visible, quick wins, administratively very simple to implement through a couple of companies, and is easily outsourced, can be outsourced to these big companies, can be outsourced abroad or foreign companies, etc. And is very much aligned with the growth narratives of our area. And I think the presenter of the Netherlands emphasized it very well. But it is the corporate policy as much as the public policy that is now shaping the food policy agendas together, and which brings us to this reinforcing cycle between public and corporate policy. And corporate power has now grown within these borders and is so powerful to such an extent, have more and more significant influence on policy orientations. The company I just spoke about, 3G Capital, has 10 times the GDP, the yearly GDP of a country like Zimbabwe. You can see the influence this has on public policies. And the examples are very numerous. I show only 2 here, but state-supported corporate expansion through these large-scale land acquisitions, or through corridor projects in Africa, in Tanzania, for example, or other examples through initiatives like the New Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition, favoring giant commodity traders, again, because of these quick fix wins and results. This brings me to the last point, and it's bringing these two together and emphasizing that what I presented to you now is what we can see and what we can track. And there's still a huge part that we cannot track, and that makes us think that concentration is actually even bigger than these figures that I just showed you. And the only example I can give you for this is France, because France is the only country that allows now to track this invisible. This invisible for us, and I mentioned in the beginning, is the corporate ownership, but mainly the corporate ownership through shareholding. Everything we measure, the concentration on land we measure, the inequality that we measure, is based on physical transaction and physical ownerships of land. With corporate and then the financialization processes coming in, this is now being held through shareholding. And this shareholding is invisible for our traditional monitoring systems, whether that's the land observatories and land statistics, or in France, the traditional SAFER system. But through two new laws being voted in France and the SAFER system, shifting the monitoring subject from physical transactions to shareholding, we can now have one case study, the French case study, showing the invisible. What we see is that actually physical transactions on land, and that's the green line at the bottom, the light green line, is about 8 times or 16 times lower nowadays than corporate transaction and shareholding transactions on land. Actually, when we look at the land mass, or the hectareage this concerns, it's actually even worse. And so in France now, what this shows is that corporate holdings represent 42% of farm entities, and they manage more than 67% of the national agricultural area. And so this is beyond the physical transactions. And what the case of the Netherlands showed about speculation, etc., we are here with the French case putting in for the first time an image and a figure on that. What it shows, what France does, we cannot or see it at very low level in other countries. And so we actually do not know in these other countries what the corporate footprint is on land. And so we actually don't know what the concentration, the degree of concentration in these countries and inequalities in the countries are at the moment. So the 10% 89 is already extreme. What this says, it's probably even worse in practice. This is the QR code to the latest report, where all these data is being presented. And I'll stop it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ward. That was super interesting, and I think it really gave us an overview of, that this isn't an isolated story from one place or another. It's something that we're seeing everywhere. So having both sides of the story, from the bottom and from the top, I think is super valuable. So thank you so much for joining us. We have about 15 minutes, a little bit less than 15 minutes left for some questions. There are already some in the Q&A. Please add in any more if you would like them. But in the meantime, I'm going to start asking a couple of the ones that have come in already. First, there is one for Apu Efer and Apu Rolando. I will ask it in English so we're not switching between languages. But so when traditional knowledge of food cultivation and forestry is supplanted by reliance on shop-bought food, how do communities preserve their cultural identity and food sovereignty? And then afterwards, I have a question for Anna, who said, so the integrated ownership model you describe for your farm is very interesting. How does that work in practice? Does everybody, how does it work in practice in between the different types of owners? And is there anything in writing about this model that could be sort of looked into a bit more? So I'll pass over first to Rolando and then perhaps to Anna, and we may have some more questions still coming in for you, Ward, so I'll come back to.
La pregunta no me fue muy claro. No sé si podría volver a repetir.
Cuando el conocimiento tradicional sobre el cultivo de alimentos y la silvicultura se va desplazado por la dependencia de los alimentos comprados en tiendas, ¿cómo preservan las comunidades su identidad cultural y su soberanía alimentaria?
Bien, si bien cierto, nuestro bosque cada vez más está quedando pobre, y eso nos obliga también a entrar al mercado, que le digo, en la ciudad, porque nosotros para poder capturar algún animal, pescar, cada vez está más difícil, y tenemos que caminar y navegar horas y horas, y en algunas ocasiones días. Entonces, eso pues, repito, nos obliga a caminar más y estar más, mayor esfuerzo. Sin embargo, para nosotros más fácil es llegar al mercado en la ciudad, ya para poder comprar algo, pero eso implica pues que no, y ya no cuenta con esa proporcionalidad de proteínas, vitaminas, entre otros, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que es por eso también nuestra salud también ya no es igual, porque antes, cuando nosotros nos alimentábamos con los recursos del bosque, de la naturaleza, pues eh, las personas eran más fuertes. Sin embargo, ahora cuando consumimos lo que viene del otro lado, pues nuestro sistema inmunológico también es débil. Y es más, nuestras plantas medicinales también están siendo pues devastados, deforestados y cada vez más disminuyendo. Entonces, em, para nosotros es una afectación enorme en ese aspecto y que eh, realmente nuestra comunidad pues vive esa realidad, ¿no? Vive esa realidad. Para poder subsistir, nosotros tenemos que ahora trabajar mucho más, caminar más y es pérdida de tiempo para nosotros caminar más y navegar más. Y eso también implica gasto, inversión, ¿no? Entonces, creo que es una de las dificultades más grandes que nosotros en la actualidad vivimos, ¿no?
Gracias. Thank you. Anna, could I pass to you for the question around the practical aspects of your divided management model? Yeah.
Yes, of course. So, how does it work? So first of all, the farms are financed, just to clarify that, through a foundation that is called the Lenteland Foundation. I can put the website in the chat later. And that foundation pre-finances the farm. And then the farm, then our local corporation is founded. That is the farm. And the farm repays the debt to the Lenteland Foundation in the form of, you could call it patient capital. So the interest is lower than the normal bank interest. And there is, it's more patient capital. So we can take 10 years to repay instead of, 4 or 6 or whatever a bank would ask for, which gives us the option not to fall into the trap of an extractive kind of agriculture. And then within the corporation, ownership is split. And how it works in practice is that as I said before, the creative ownership is with the farmers that are working at the farm as if they are entrepreneurs. So we made a business plan. We wrote a business plan for this place where we're farming right now. And we also applied to the farm with a business plan. We are responsible for making that business plan work. So we have business lines that need to be profitable, and we are managing the day-to-day operations at the farm. So we both came up with a vision for the place, but also just with all the practical executions of that vision when it comes to management planning of all these business lines. Then there's the economic ownership that is split because everybody can buy sort of shares in the farm. Let's call it the new shareholders, as Ward was speaking about. But the community can buy shares in the farm, certificates, and become co-owners of the farm. There's a limit to the amount that you can put on the table. So we don't have people that have like a huge amount of shares. Like there's a top at 100K, but also there's more importantly there's a top at a level of influence that you that are attached to these shares. So everybody who is a co-owner of the farm is welcome to join for our annual meeting. They have to. They are sort of critically looking at our plans, and they are also more than that. It's about relationships. So it's also a support network with which we enable this farm, and they are all the economic owners of this farm, and they together with the profitable business lines that we are responsible for as farmers, plus the economic ownership of the co-owners of the farm that buy certificates in the farm, we sort of repay the debt to the Lenteland Foundation, and with that money that flows back to the Lenteland Foundation, another farm is pre-financed. So that's how it spreads, almost like a mycelium, you could say. And the third ownership is the juridical ownership. That is with the Lenteland Foundation, who ensures that this farm will be a regenerative community farm. So as soon as I violate those principles by, for example, next week I'm going to deep plow the whole place and spray pesticides everywhere, then they have the right to remove me from my position as a farmer because I violated the principles of the place, and that's juridically fixed. So if you want to dive, there are all kinds of membership options in this community. There are all kinds of feedback loops between these three types of ownership. If you're interested in that, you can look at the Lenteland website. I will put it down in the chat and dive into it a little bit more.
Thank you so much, Anna. That's very interesting. We have 2 minutes left. There's a question for you, Ward. In fact, there's a couple of questions for you, but maybe if you can answer very briefly so we don't run out of time. I'll just read the first one. So if huge corporations are buying large swathes of land, but the investments come from large numbers of shareholders, so pension funds, how are they determining the use of the land they're buying? For example, income, like if they're largely investors, what role do they have in determining what the use of the land is, or are they investing in it in a different way?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for the question. If it's these huge corporates and totally financialized companies, often it's totally detached. The investors and the reality on the ground are often totally detached. We've seen that with huge investments from European and North American companies in South Africa, for example. The investors and the shareholders of the main company were unaware of the activities on the ground, often managed by daughter companies in a huge chain of sub-companies between the investment fund and the operation company on the ground. And so when we made the main investors aware of what was happening on the ground, or where the money was going for what type of activities, often there was reactions from shareholders, and often from the mother company as well. We've seen, for example, investment funds related to American universities pulling out of land investments in South Africa because of the sensitivity of it. This could have been because of their intentions to not touch land, or their image being affected. But in any case, it showed us that there was a real detachment between the investors and the shareholders of the mother company and the activities on the ground.
Thank you very much, Ward, for that answer. And I'm afraid we've run out of time for any more questions and answers. But I wanted to thank all of our speakers and all of our participants for their time and their thoughtful contributions to this discussion. Before we sign off, I also wanted to very quickly share some details of our next planned webinars on revitalising traditional knowledge in food systems and on women in food systems, and there'll be more after that as well. If you've enjoyed today, please do watch out for these and share details with others who you think might be interested. We're also still looking for some speakers for these, so if you know someone who would be great on one of these topics, do share their names with us. A video recording of this event will be made available on YouTube in the next few days. Do like and subscribe it, and if you've enjoyed this. And finally, as I said at the beginning, this is the first time we've done a webinar like this, so we'd really appreciate your feedback. If you have made it this far, we have a very, very, very short survey, and we'd love to hear what you thought about this webinar. You can access it through the link in the chat or the QR code that's on the screen now. And that's it, folks. Thanks especially to our speakers, but also to all our participants for giving up their time to join us today. We hope you enjoy it, and we'll see you again, I hope. Thanks very much.